atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Oklahoma Christian University political scientist Trey Orndorff.
It's great to be back on the midweek show with you.
Yeah, and as I said, there were a number of things I didn't think we'd have a chance to get to on the weekend show, but this is the great thing about having this midweek supporter show, is we can get to these extra things. And so the first of these things, I've been itching to talk about that. If you're a longtime listener, you know that my favorite government agency is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. And I really got to, next time I go to DC, I really need to go there and see if I can get some swag or something like that. They got to have a t-shirt.
You should take a picture with them, nothing else. Be like, listen, totally. How many people are going to take a picture with that, right?
Yes.
I mean, you'll be one of a kind.
I actually should, do something. Anyway, now I'm just fanboying out. I'm going to stop now. But the Supreme Court recently released a decision regarding the agency. And of course, there was no way I wasn't going to talk about that. So the issue that the court took up concerned the funding mechanism for the agency, because it was set up as an independent agency as part of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, and that followed the financial crisis of 2008. And one of the things they did to make it independent, or at least more independent, Congress decided to fund it through the Federal Reserve up to a capped amount that adjusted every year for inflation, meaning that the CFPB wouldn't have to go through the yearly funding approval process as most other agencies do. So that would insulate it from some of that, from some of those political issues, right? Now, this funding mechanism was challenged by a number of business groups who said that it violated the Constitution's appropriation clause, which, if you don't have that memorized, says that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Now, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously agreed, the three judges on that, and the government then appealed it to the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision, overturned the Fifth Circuit. And the opinion, it's kind of a weird grouping, the opinion was written by Justice Thomas, and it held basically that all the Appropriations Clause requires is that Congress identify the source of funds for an agency and that they authorize the expenditure of funds for a specific purpose. And that was done in the funding of the CFPB. So they're good to go. And Thomas also pointed out that there is a long tradition of this sort of funding mechanism indirectly. And he mentioned the post office, the customs service. And finally, they pointed out that, well, there's also this statutory cap in place. And so that even increases accountability. Now, Justices Alito and Gorsuch did not agree. And in a dissent written by Alito, they said, hey, this funding structure undermines the very purpose of the Appropriations Clause. And Alito wrote of the majority's view, the court holds that the Appropriations Clause is satisfied by any law that authorizes the executive to take any amount of money from any source for any period of time for any lawful purpose. That holding has the virtue of clarity, but such clarity comes at too high a price. There are times when it is our duty to say simply that a law that blatantly attempts to circumvent the Constitution goes too far. This is such a case. So, Trey, do you agree with Justice Alito that this law blatantly attempts to circumvent the Constitution?
Well, I'll start by saying I think this once again points out, and I always bring it up every time I can, that Ken is wrong, that conservative justices don't always vote in lockstep and they're not part of the Satanist group. But I do think that Alito, in fact, is wrong in this case. I think Thomas is correct. I think Alito is wrong. And specifically, but I will give Alito some credit. I think he is right if he removes the words unconstitutional here and says it is a bad, in other words, says this is bad policy. And what I mean by that is we have a long history now of Congress delegating more and more and pulling away more and more of its tools to the executive branch. But there's a difference. There's a fundamental difference between bad policy and not being constitutional under the appropriations clause. And I think Thomas is absolutely correct that you have to come back to the idea of what appropriation is. And it's simply a law that authorizes, in his words, this is simply a law that authorizes expenditures from a specific source of public money for a designated purpose, end quote, right? And I don't know, Alito and Gorsuch do not respond to that in a meaningful way. Instead, what they're responding to is to say, well, we think this is bad policy. And I don't disagree on the policy, but again, you got to separate constitutional interpretation from policy.
Yeah, and that is exactly my take. I mean, they tried to make some distinctions between the CFPB funding and the post office and customs service funding. And those are distinctions, but they're distinctions without a difference because you have to come back to the constitutional text. And Alito was trying to be sort of, dismissive or trying to score some points, saying that any law that, you can do for any amount at any time. And the answer is, well, yeah, that's what it says, dude. I mean, sorry if you don't like that, but show me where in the appropriations clause it says, well, only if it's for this amount of money, or no, you're right. It's a policy disagreement.
If you move away from a textualist point of view and you say, well, as Thomas does here and takes a look at the history of it, I mean, what is it? 40 years later, that's the way they do it. I mean, there's long-standing originalist practice as well.
Yeah, and not only that, but it's not like Congress couldn't pass a law that changes that funding mechanism. And there's also that statutory cap. And so this idea that this agency is just outside of all oversight, no, Congress could decide, in a heartbeat, right, to pass a law and change that or eliminate the agency altogether. So it's not some crazy rogue agency and that's another part of the dissent that I found so off the point, is they're saying, well, this is an agency that has a lot of impact on people's lives. And my thought was, well, so what? What does that have to do with the Constitution exactly?
Well, I'll add a little bit here. I've watched Gorsuch closely. And again, this isn't my primary area as a political scientist, but because I do the show with Ken, I've spent a lot more time on constitutional law than I have a lot of other things anymore. And I now teach that. But be that as it may, point being is I think Gorsuch specifically, he has significant policy issues with how much Congress across the board has a delegated power to the executive branch via agencies. And I think he would add on to any particular court case that would rein in that, whether it's constitutional or otherwise. I think that is a policy bugaboo for him, and it seems pretty adamant. And again, I don't necessarily disagree with him on the policy side. I just disagree with trying to argue that it's unconstitutional. I think if you watch Gorsuch carefully, he is a vehement anti-delegation of power.
You can make an argument. I would be much more receptive to an argument that said the enabling legislation and the powers that are given to this agency violate the delegate or the non-delegation doctrine. I don't think they do, but I think that's a much more straightforward, intellectually honest argument than trying to say the funding mechanism somehow plays into non-delegation, if you see what I mean.
Oh, no, I don't disagree about it. I'm going to say you can pick any part of the Constitution, and Gorsuch is going to come down on the side that restricts the ability of delegating power, just regardless of, whichever portion of the Constitution you're taking a look at, which I think that's why we have seen him break significantly with his other conservative congresspersons, especially Thomas.
I'm trying to imagine a conversation between Thomas and Alito. How disappointed must Sam have been saying, what do you mean, Clarence? You can't go with them. You can't write the opinion, dude. I said, I'm sorry. You still want to come on a yacht trip this summer? I don't know. Anyway.
Wow. So you're saying that he was bucking this so that he shows that he's not bribed? Is that what it is?
I'm definitely not saying that for sure, but oh well.
But you're not saying that.
I'm not saying. Yes, exactly. All right. Well, speaking of inappropriate taking of bribes or things like that, which is something I'm not saying Clarence Thomas did. There is another instance in which maybe I think there's more of a case to be made for that. And maybe we should move on to that story, Trey.
Sure. The U.S. government this week has set forward a bunch of legal details on how allegedly AT&T potentially bought several Illinois House members, including House Speaker Michael Madigan. This is going to trial in September, but things are probably a little bit fishy because AT&T has already agreed to $23 million in fines already. Now, in this case, the primary crux of the bribery issue is a representative, Edward Acevedo, was paid to pass legislation. You heard that right. Paid to pass legislation. And the goal was for AT&T to be kept from having to be the carrier of last resort. Now, for most people, you probably don't know what this is, but once upon a time, one of the legal mechanisms in order to be a telephone carrier was you had to be able to provide service even to locations that weren't going to make you money, i.e. out in rural areas. And you call this the this is the carrier of last resort, meaning you have to maintain landlines. And again, I know for most people listening to this, you probably don't have a landline. And even if you do have a landline, you don't have the kind of landline we're talking about here. You're probably having some kind of voice over IP. And what you might not know is those old kind of landlines, they're really, really expensive, not just to keep and maintain them. They're also expensive. And I know this because this is what my buddy does for a living. He works for telecom. They need the most electricity of anything to make them work. And it's always on. The circuit is always happening. And so it's expensive to maintain them. And so AT&T didn't want to have to do this. And so they basically paid out individuals to make this happen. Now, in emails, Mike, about this, which the jokes just to make themselves. The AT&T officials doing this called it the friends and family package. Which I mean, if you're going to do something illegal, why are you sending email? Like, you would think in this day and age, you'd be on, a different service for this. Okay, you're sending emails about it. You're calling it the friends and family package. And I am not joking. This is not a tease. This is from the documents itself. You can go look at this. They paid they paid Edward himself $22,500, but not all at once. No, it's AT&T in 9 monthly installments. It's kind of like a subsidized phone plan. And I just thought, talk about kind of institutional bureaucracy. You're gonna bribe, but you're gonna have to stick with your normal subsidization bribe. We would like you on the bribery plan. I mean, obviously I'm laughing about this, but it's not funny. But what the broader question here, Mike, and I think this is one that goes down. A lot of people focus, say, on the president, they focus on Congress. But as I talk to my students about, a lot of the most important things that happen to you are not happening at that level. And that's actually where probably some of the least amount of kind of corrupt behavior occurs, because there's so much attention placed to it. But especially in today's age, when we don't have a lot of local media, people don't pay a ton of attention to local politics, the things they do, even though they do some really important things. I mean, we talked about it in the main show. I mean, it is your local legislature that's determining the districts that you're going to be voting in for national elections. But because they don't have the same kind of scrutiny that others do, this is not probably, it's not probably, the data suggests that this is far more likely to occur at the state level. But it is funny that it's in Illinois. So, Mike, what's kind of your take on this?
Well, the same as yours, I think, largely, is that I'm very concerned about state and local level corruption, because I think I know it's going to be a lot more likely for a bunch of reasons. Because for one thing, you have less sophisticated legislators. They tend to be easier to bribe. They, for a lot of, they can go on the plan like that. I don't know. Not only that, but.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but I think one thing that we don't think about, and this happens here in Oklahoma, for example, we have what we proudly, they think of here in Oklahoma as having a part-time legislature. And the problem with that, though, is it means we're paying our legislature something like $22,500 a year. and very, very few people can actually do it. So, for example, me, I could neither continue to do my job and work in the legislature, right? I'd get fired. Nor could I postpone my job in some way and then work full time as in the legislature. We have term limits. You can only serve for a few. So I could then come back to work. But you can't do it. But we don't allow those kinds of things in many state legislatures. They're kind of proudly part-time. They're proudly non-professionalized. But empirically, what that suggests is they're going to be far more easy to bribe, and they're going to be far less. And the sets of people who can do it are going to be just far fewer. So again, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think sometimes we don't always understand what those state level choices mean for these kinds of issues.
We hope you enjoyed this preview of our supporters exclusive midweek show. If you'd like to hear the rest of the episode, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. Supporters get ad-free access to all of our shows, membership in our Politics Guys Discord group where you can join in on the conversation, and other benefits at different levels of support. To become a supporter, go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo, we're @politicsguys, or through PayPal. You'll find all of our support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in a position to become a financial supporter, that's not a problem. Just send me an email at mike@politicsguys.com, and I'll be happy to get that set up for you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,